Silence fell before the numbers did. Not bombs. Not tanks. Just a legal signature that changed the global financial order. Stay with me till the end. Because what you are about to hear explains why money itself is no longer safe. If you want to understand how power really works in the modern world, and how fast it can turn against its owners, subscribe now. Because this story is still unfolding. In early 2024, Europe crossed a line no major financial power had crossed before. They didn't just freeze Russian assets, they seized them. $105 billion. Central bank reserves. Sovereign funds. State-held assets. Transferred. Irreversibly. The decision was framed as moral. As necessary. As innovative. Europe would fund Ukraine. Without raising taxes. Without issuing debt. Without asking voters for sacrifice. On paper, it looked brilliant. But history is filled with moments that look brilliant on paper, right before they collapse reality. Because Europe misunderstood something fundamental. They thought they were using a financial weapon. What they actually did was expose the weapon itself. And once exposed, every country on Earth began planning how to survive it. This is not a story about Russia's invasion. That moral debate exists separately. This is a story about credibility, trust, and how quickly empires lose both. Let me take you back. February 2024. The war in Ukraine was entering its third year. Public fatigue was growing. Budgets were stretched, political patience was thin. And sitting quietly inside European banks were Russian assets worth $105 billion. Frozen since the start of the war. Untouchable, or so everyone thought. Freezing assets during conflict was normal. Confiscating them was not. Sovereign reserves had always been sacred, even during wars, even between enemies. Because once you break that rule, no reserve anywhere is truly safe. European lawyers found a workaround. A narrow legal path. A justification built on emergency powers and reconstruction needs. In March, the announcement came. Russian state assets would be seized and transferred to Ukraine. The reaction was euphoric. Editorials praised the boldness. Leaders spoke of economic statecraft. Ukraine celebrated. For 2 weeks, Europe believed it had won. Then Moscow moved. Not emotionally. Not loudly. Strategically. The first move came without speeches. Russia announced permanent nationalization of all European corporate assets on Russian soil. No temporary measures. No negotiations. Permanent. The value was higher than what Europe seized. $120 billion. And this wasn't abstract money. This was factories, infrastructure, supply chains. Volkswagen had spent 3 decades in Russia. Factories built from scratch. Workforces trained. Entire cities economically dependent on those plants. 30 years of patient investment ended with a single decree. The factories didn't shut down. They were handed over. Siemens lost power grids. Rail systems. Industrial networks that took generations to build. Shell lost energy projects that defined its future strategy. Sakhalin, Arctic LNG. Joint ventures once worth tens of billions. Gone. Not compensated. Not negotiated. Taken. And it didn't stop with corporate giants, food producers. Retail chains. Breweries. Dairy plants. Hundreds of European companies woke up to find their life's work erased. But Russia didn't let those assets sit idle. They sold them at massive discounts to China. Factories built by European money were now producing for Chinese brands. Energy infrastructure designed by European engineers was now fueling Chinese growth. Market share Europe spent decades earning changed hands in months. This was not retaliation, it was repositioning. Europe lost presence, China gained dominance. Then came Russia's second move. Subtle, quiet, devastating. Russia announced that all energy and commodity exports would settle only in rubles or yuan. No euros, no exceptions. Europe assumed buyers would refuse. They didn't. India adapted. China expanded existing systems. Turkey created bilateral mechanisms. Within months, most Russian trade bypassed European currency entirely. Sanctions depended on financial dependence. That dependence disappeared. And the message was unmistakable. Western financial systems were no longer mandatory. They were optional. The third move changed everything. Russia, alongside BRICS partners, announced a $150 billion reserve fund. Its sole purpose was to protect sovereign reserves from Western seizure. This is where fear entered the room. Central banks around the world took notice. Because reserves are not investments. They are survival tools. They exist for crises, for trade, for stability. And Europe had just demonstrated that reserves were political, conditional. Saudi Arabia watched closely. $600 billion in reserves, held largely in Western systems. If it could happen to Russia, why not them? Singapore asked the same question. So did Abu Dhabi, Beijing, Riyadh, even Switzerland felt the tremor. Neutrality had always been its promise. But frozen Russian assets sat inside Swiss banks. Neutrality, once questioned, never fully recovers. The capital movement didn't make headlines. It never does. Reserve managers don't panic. They rebalance. 5% here, 10% there. But when dozens of countries do this simultaneously, hundreds of billions move quietly. The euro weakened. Bond demand softened. Borrowing costs rose. Germany began paying more to finance its debt. These weren't crashes. They were erosions. The kind empires rarely notice until it's too late. Europe gained 1 year of funding for Ukraine. The cost was permanent. Lost corporate assets. Lost markets. Lost trust. China emerged stronger. Russia adapted. And the world learned a lesson Europe never intended to teach. Your money is only yours, until politics decide otherwise. Financial power is not enforced by force. It is enforced by belief. The belief that rules will be honored, that contracts are sacred, that reserves are untouchable. Once that belief cracks, systems unravel slowly. The SWIFT system had once been the backbone of global finance. Russia prepared alternatives years earlier. By 2024, those alternatives were operational, connected, integrated. Trade flowed without Western permission. And once permission is no longer required, power fades. Europe didn't lose influence overnight. It surrendered the future quietly. This wasn't stupidity, it was desperation. Political pressure overcame strategic thinking, and the consequences are not paid by politicians. They are paid by workers, by shareholders, by future generations. History doesn't record intentions, it records outcomes. And the outcome of this decision was not Russian collapse. It was Western vulnerability. Empires rarely fall from attack. They fall from precedent. From the moment others realize the system is no longer safe. The seizure of $105 billion will be studied for decades, not as punishment, but as a warning that once trust is weaponized, it disappears. And when trust disappears, money follows. The question now is not whether the damage can be reversed. It can't. The question is how far it spreads. And whether the world has already moved on while Europe is still explaining its decision. So ask yourself this. If your country's reserves were frozen tomorrow, who would protect them? If your savings depended on political alignment, would you trust the system? And if financial power depends on belief, what happens when belief is gone?